Welcome, or welcome back, to the video analysis of who dishonoured Ashara Dayne. For those that haven't already, I recommend going back and watching the first video in the series for a detailed explanation of the points I make hereafter, but we will summarise the content real quickly. To begin with, Ashara Dayne was a book-only character who had some importance to Ned Stark's early life as well as Varys and Selmy's. Ned Stark met Ashara Dayne at the Tournament of Harrenhal, wherein she danced with him, as well as several other important characters in the story. Through Catelyn and Arya's chapters in A Song of Ice and Fire, we are led to the conclusion that Eddard had a romantic relationship with Ashara Dayne. However, in A Dance with the Dragons, we are given strong evidence that Eddard's older brother Brandon, a prolific womanizer, and hence more likely to have had the relationship with Ashara Dayne. In Sir Barristan's chapters, we are told that Ashara Dayne was dishonoured at the Tourney of Harrenhal, which we conclude to mean someone had sex with her, and the indiscretion was discovered and she suffered a loss of reputation. However, I believe that the evidence against Brandon Stark is flimsy, seeing as in the north, where he committed the one offence that we know of, he was a big fish in a proverbially small pond. Ashara Dayne was the flower of House Dayne, and according to some, the most beautiful woman at court. In the south, at the Tourney of Harrenhal, Brandon Stark would have to compete with a number of other very powerful, very promiscuous men, such as Robert Baratheon, Oberyn Martell, and in this case, Rhaegar Targaryen, Crown Prince and future King of the Seven Kingdoms. And I assert in the previous video that Ashara Dayne was meant by House Dayne to replace Prince Rhaegar's current consort, Princess Elia Martell, a woman of poor health, threatened by pregnancy, who runs the risk of dying in childbirth, and several High Lords, especially Tywin Lannister, would like to replace Elia Martell with their daughters. Ashara has the leg up in being already instantiated in Rhaegar's household as Elia's lady-in-waiting. Thus, she and House Dayne have too much to lose by Ashara becoming romantically or sexually attached to a lesser man like Brandon Stark. Barbary Dustin, then of House Ryswell, who was Brandon Stark's former lover, had something to gain by sleeping with Brandon Stark, potentially becoming his wife. Ashara gains nothing, and Brandon would suffer consequences as a result, namely Sir Arthur Dayne, the greatest swordsman in the realm, killing him in a duel. Thus, disregarding Eddard and Brandon Stark as possible culprits, we must look for another suspect. Another prolific womanizer, who's skilled in combat, who has motive to dishonour Ashara Dayne, and who has less to fear from Sir Arthur. Or perhaps I should say, more to fear. Get her with child, and the prize is all but won. Do I need to remind you that a marriage that has not been consummated can be set aside? Tyrion 4, A Storm of Swords. Elia's marriage to Rhaegar couldn't easily be annulled, considering that she's consummated already and produced a child. And her general good character means if Ashara, or whichever substitute, was brought in and had anything less than a stellar reputation, there would be no public support at all for the change. Thus you can see the party, which at this moment would have the most to gain from Ashara being dishonoured in public light, would be the Martells themselves, the incumbents. Elia may not have the violent disposition to deal with it, but her brother Oberyn certainly does. You may recall that Oberyn made mock of the many suitors presented to Elia during their marriage tour. I preferred to amuse myself by mocking my sister's suitors. The only one who was even halfway presentable was young Baelor Hightower, a pretty lad, and my sister was half in love with him until he had the misfortune to fart in our presence. I promptly named him Baelor Breakwind, and after that Elia couldn't look at him without laughing. I was a monstrous young fellow. Someone should have sliced out my vile tongue. A cutting remark can be as apt to murder one's marriage prospects as a sharpened blade. It is suggested that the many marriage prospects on the lead up to Castle Rock were not to be taken seriously, and whether at the insistence of the Princess of Dawn, or by Oberyn's own initiative, his mockery made sure none of them were. We were on a quest of sorts. Quest that took us to Starfall, the Arbor, Old Town, the Shield Islands, Crakehall, and finally Casterly Rock. But our true destination was marriage. The Martells do not have a navy, but they likely keep a few ships available for personal use, patrol duties and whatnot. So, when departing on their marriage tour from their home at Sunspear, the next destination they would reach was Starfall, which has its own safe port to call into, and this will be relevant later. Now, according to calculations done on the wiki, Sir Arthur Dayne could be as much as 2 years younger than Oberyn Martell, though possibly older. That is to say, he's of the same generation and the same approximate age. So when Oberyn's going on this trip and he's 14 or 15, Sir Arthur Dayne could be as young as 12, though could be older. In any case, at this age, he wouldn't be a knight, but a squire. I bring this up because in Tyrion's chapters, Oberyn outlines a few examples of the suitors named in their mocking pseudonyms. There was little Lord Lazy Eye, Squire Squishlips, one I named Well That Walks, that sort of thing. And in fact, Squire Squishlips gets the honour of a second mention. Just so. It was my belief that the mothers had cooked up this plot between them. Squire Squishlips and his ilk, and the various pimply young maidens who had been paraded for me, were the almonds before the feast, meant only to whet our appetites. The main course was to be served at Casterly Rock. Tyrion 10, A Storm of Swords. A young Arthur Dayne was presented to Elia Martell for marriage, though mocked mercilessly, by Oberyn, which could well have formed a rift between the two families. Arthur Dayne swearing vengeance upon Oberyn and the rest of his family, or at least hardening his heart towards them. And to be fair, it could have been Sir Arthur's older brother, but that's really the same difference. Unlike his father, the Prince of Dragonstone has very few things in which he can bargain with, which can bring people to his side. Marriage to the future king of the Seven Kingdoms is a great prize, but it can only be given once. King Maegor the Cruel tried, and failed, to implement a polygamous system. The Faith of the Seven and the small folk would not have it. Prince Rhaegar has quite a bit of popular support, and many powerful allies, but this single prize he has to offer creates this zero-sum game between his supporters, leaving him in this precarious position where he needs to play on their various ambitions, for which he can turn to his advantage, but in turn creates this dangerous competition between them, which they work at cross purposes. So it is little surprise that Oberyn would do what is necessary to protect his sister Elia's position, up to and including dishonouring Ashara Dayne, in order to reduce her value to such that she would not be considered for princess consort. It would certainly be in Oberyn's wheelhouse in order to embarrass Ashara publicly, in order to diminish her standing as a potential rival to Elia. And with the assassination of Lord Ironwood, he takes great initiative in protecting his family from the upstart vassals. And he wouldn't even need to personally violate her. I mean, why take the risk? Why get involved in a duel which his life would be in danger, when he could merely spread the rumour that it happened? And along comes the perfect patsy, Ned Stark, who just happened to be duped into dancing with Ashara Dayne by his brother. Perfect fodder for rumour. However, the two dancing together is not enough fodder for speculation. After all, several other men danced with her. But if Ashara was seen entering into the Stark encampment for some reason, that fact would be enough. But why would Ashara end up in the Stark camp? And while the Red Viper of Dawn is certainly a dangerous enemy to have, there is one other candidate for the dishonouring of Ashara that has even more incentive than any of the others mentioned so far. And that, of course, is King Aerys himself. Under no circumstances but the most extreme of treason would anyone lay a hand on him. Sir Arthur, as a member of the King's Guard, must protect the King's life with his own. He cannot challenge him to a duel. or get revenge against him for any circumstances. Everyone in the realm, up to and including Prince Rhaegar his son and Queen Rhaella his wife, must suffer his various abuses, and thus if he turns his eye to Ashara Dayne, no one can protect her. Not her brother, or her mistress, or her mistress's brother. Prince Rhaegar and Queen Rhaella may have had the political will to be able to stop Aerys, but Rhaella was in King's Landing, and Prince Rhaegar was sent on a wild goose chase, distracting him while Aerys went to work. Now let's examine this for a moment. King Aerys, all of a sudden, declares the Knight of the Laughing Tree to be an enemy of the state, perhaps viewing, as is stated, that it was Jaime Lannister, serving as Tywin's agent, trying to undermine him. But equally likely, there was just a ruse to get Prince Rhaegar distracted in order to disrupt Rhaegar's ability to form a coalition to depose him. If the Mad King didn't come to this notion on his own, it's likely that Varys would have pointed it out to him. This serves King Aerys in a lot of ways. Firstly, it is a slight intended to demoralise Sir Arthur, a wayward Kingsguard knight whose loyalty is more with the son rather than the father. It is a slight to the Dornish, to Elia Martell especially, as King Aerys distrusts and dislikes the Dornish as much as Aegon IV did. Nor did the birth of King Aerys' first grandchild, a girl named Rhaenys, born on Dragonstone in 280 AC, do aught to reconcile father and son. When Prince Rhaegar returned to the Red Keep to present his daughter to his own mother and father, Queen Rhaella embraced the babe warmly, but King Aerys refused to touch or hold the child and complained that she smells Dornish. The Targaryen kings, Aerys II, the world of ice and fire. By sullying a handmaiden under her protection, he slights Elia as well. And in so doing, since Elia is under Rhaegar's protection, it's a further slight to Rhaegar. And King Aerys has always been desirous of the ladies of the court. It's quite common for him to maintain a court with all the most beautiful women in the land so he can seduce them, and seducing his wives' handmaidens is very much in his modus operandi, so why not his daughters-in-laws? And there's the greatest prize of all. Ashara, as Sir Arthur Dayne's sister, is very likely one of Prince Rhaegar's agents, either responsible for communicating with Prince Rhaegar's allies, or at least perceived that way by Varys and Aerys. If Aerys could capture her while Rhaegar was distracted, he could force a confession out of her that she was assisting Prince Rhaegar in what is essentially high treason. Forming a council to depose King Aerys is very much treason, and if it came out, a credible witness like Ashara Dayne confessing to this would give Aerys means to execute Prince Rhaegar for treason and replace him with his much more preferred younger son Viserys. Had any whiff of proof come into their hands to show that Prince Rhaegar was conspiring against his father, King Aerys' loyalists would have most certainly have used it to bring about the prince's downfall. Indeed, certain of the king's men had gone so far as to suggest that Aerys should disinherit his disloyal son, and name his younger brother heir to the Iron Throne in his stead. Prince Viserys was but 7 years of age, and his eventual accession would certainly mean a regency wherein they themselves would rule as regents. Whatever sexual gratification Aerys got out of Ashara in the process would be icing on the cake. We see an almost one-to-one parallel here with Tyrion's relationship with Shae, this whore which he brought into his household, he instantiated as his wife Sansa's handmaiden. During Tyrion's trial, Shae had the most damning evidence to convict him with. The crescendo to a long line of witnesses Cersei brought forth to shame her brother Tyrion. And at the very end of the Tyrion's arc in A Storm of Swords, we find out that Tywin was in fact sleeping with Shae as well. And Tywin, being Aerys' best friend at one point, may even share a certain way of doing things. From this I propose that King Aerys, of all the men at the Tourney of Harrenhal, had the most reason and the most cause and the most agency in order to dishonour Ashara Dayne, and get away without the retribution of the many men in Ashara's life who would have to protect her. So, under this circumstance, what would Ashara do? If she was being pursued by the king's men, where would she go? She cannot turn to her brother, because her brother, as a member of the King's Guard, would be compelled to follow the King's orders. She cannot turn to Sir Barristan for the same reasons, even if she didn't know about his affection. So, under these circumstances, in order to avoid capture and interrogation, Ashara may do, as Aerys Stark would do later, to go seek refuge with this guy she danced with one time, taking a risk on the generosity of a stranger, and one might say the stranger, being one aspect of the faith of the Seven. Aerys Stark, on a dying horse, fled to the wall to be with Jon, carrying with her some sensitive information about Arnulf Karstark's plans to betray Stannis to the Boltons. And in a slight inversion, Ashara Dayne's fleeing from King Aerys, seeking refuge with the Starks to avoid offering up information which could be damning to Prince Rhaegar. And like Aerys Stark, Ashara Dayne isn't entirely without political acumen, overlooked, not receiving the great outpouring of public support as Lyanna Stark would later receive, and the fake Arya, Jane Poole, who's a stand-in for the real Arya, who is herself a stand-in for Lyanna Stark. Alicent and Ashara, conversely, have to look after themselves. The people in their lives are either dead or demoralised, and in spite of the horrific circumstances she finds herself in, she makes a very astute decision. House Stark is isolated, not easy for House Targaryen and the Central Powers to make war upon. They are at the nexus of an alliance of 4 of the great houses of the realm, and given the distance from Starfall to Winterfell, any favours she might owe to the Stark boys is unlikely that she'd have to make good on it, though she does later. Unlike the Red Viper, who may hold any favours she owes him over her head to some extreme degree. Now, whether Brandon Stark took advantage or not, cannot say for certain, and perhaps Aerys did in fact get there first, managing to practically dishonour Ashara. She only escaped after the fact. Indeed, if he did instruct a confession from her, it's possible that he used it to compel Rhaegar rather than acting on it fully, blackmailing Rhaegar and bringing the Crown Prince to heel, as it were. But the more insidious possibility, which I prefer, is that no one ended up sleeping with Ashara at all during the tournament. The damage her reputation suffered was purely conjecture and rumour.
For a lie? You've yet to ask me for the truth of what happened.
The truth does not matter, Rhaenyra. Only perception. You have exposed yourself. Now we must both suffer the consequences.
In an absence of evidence, perceptions become reality. And at this point, if Ashara was dismissed from the service of Princess Elia, it may have been the best for her to have returned to Starfall and avoided politics from then on out. Unbeknownst to them, in the intervening year, Rhaegar would shift his focus away from Ashara towards Lyanna, having discovered a new solution to the fulfillment of his prophecy, which would become more urgent as the birth of his second child, Aegon, left Elia unable to bear more children. However, if Ashara did remain at court, the rumours not yet circulating and the will to keep playing the Game of Thrones remained, things would suddenly get a whole lot worse. Now, for the most part, as Elia's handmaiden, she'll be spending her time on Dragonstone rather than at court at King's Landing, so she would avoid the worst of the backlash for a while. If we consider Daenerys' House of the Undying vision, one of the scenes she is shown is of Rhaegar, we presume it's Rhaegar, proposing a name for his new son called Aegon. The woman in the scene, who is nursing the child, asks if the man with the dark indigo eyes, if he'll make a song for the boy. And he said the boy already has a song, the Song of Ice and Fire. A few interesting things about this scene and the scene that follows. Daenerys assumes the woman is his wife Elia. We have been given no physical description of the woman, only that she is a woman and that she was nursing the child. However, there's significance in the naming convention in Westeros, which tends to incur on the day of the child's birth, thus the birthday becomes the name day.
You have a son.
It's a boy.
A new heir, Your Grace. Had you and the Queen chosen a name?
Dayne.
I bring this up because in A Dance with the Dragons, during John Connington's chapter A Griffin Reborn, when reflecting back on Elia Martell, after the birth of Prince Aegon, she nearly died. To be explicit, this might well mean that she wasn't available to nurse the child for several days after the birth, and another woman, some trusted handmaiden or wet nurse, would have to take care of the child while she was incapacitated. If Ashara stuck around after the Tourney of Harrenhal, and she still retained Prince Rhaegar's trust, it may be that she was the woman in the vision of the House and the Undying, which means she was present after the tourney and at least up until Rhaegar departed to kidnap Lyanna. This is speculation, of course, and I want to cover an alternative possibility to this vision of the House of the Undying later in a different video. But for now, I assume that Ashara remained in Dragonstone following Rhaegar's departure. The result of this is, unfortunately, that when Rhaegar's protection departed along with her brother Sir Arthur, Elia Martell and her children were recalled from Dragonstone to King's Landing to be acted as hostages for King Aerys. And if it so happened that Ashara Dayne came with them, she would also be within Aerys' reach. Granted, it is ambiguous as to when Elia was transferred from Dragonstone to King's Landing, and whether Aerys had previously violated her during the Tourney of Harrenhal, or she had eluded him. This would almost certainly be when he actually dishonours her. We know that someone somewhere did do this deed, as there was never told that she was married, and at some point she has a stillborn daughter out of wedlock. Sir Barristan is quite clear that she was indeed dishonoured, and in the passage just above it, he remarks that Ashara Dayne's appearance of those purple eyes were the same as Daenerys's. He even thinks it's possible that he was looking at Ashara's daughter, though he dismisses the notion because, from his understanding, Ashara's daughter died in stillbirth. However, what we're told isn't always true, and Barristan himself admits that he doesn't have the same skill as Varys or Littlefinger when it comes to intrigue. At some point, she definitely leaves the service of Elia Martell and returns to Starfall. She is supposedly there to receive Ned Stark and Dorne when he returns from the Tower of Joy, and sometime later, she supposedly ends up committing suicide, throwing herself from the tower. So what I'm suggesting here is that Daenerys is in fact Ashara's daughter by Aerys. Now Ashara has dark hair and Aerys has the standard silver, but you should recall that Ashara's nephew, Edric Dayne, has ash-blonde hair. And whilst 3 of the Daynes, which have been described to us in the books, all have some degree of purple eyes, they all have different hair colours. Given that it's Dorne, which a much more diverse ethnic admixture there, more of a stigma towards incest, and not having the same level of genetic purity as House Targaryen or House Stark for that matter, it's entirely possible that they could have much more heterozygous genes. So Ashara could have a silver hair or a blonde hair recessive that's covered up by the presentation of dark hair. And given that she'd be exposed to Aerys towards the back end of the war, about the same time as Rhaella was supposedly having her farewell violation scene, these 2 pregnancies could carry on at the same rate. The sight had filled him with disquiet, reminding him of Aerys Targaryen and the way a burning would arouse him. A king had no secrets from his Kingsguard. Relations between Aerys and his queen had been strained during the last years of his reign. They slept apart and did their best to avoid each other during the waking hours. But whenever Aerys gave a man to the flames, Queen Rhaella would have a visitor in the night. Jaime 2, A Feast for Crows. Both of them being daughters of King Aerys, and both of them presenting strongly as Valyrian featured, but with one subtle difference, the difference in age of the mothers. Ashara Dayne was in her late teens, early 20s, whereas Rhaella was in her late 30s. This by no means disqualifies her from carrying a child to term. However, the main comparable example we have in the story is that of Queen Visenya, had her child at 40, by Aegon, who was perhaps sterile, and with the help of some unusual medical attention, to say the least. Though I'd be remiss in neglecting to mention Alysanne, who had her last child, the Princess Gale, at age 44. The last time she successfully took a child to term was Princess Visera 9 years earlier. That would have been at the age of 35. This last daughter was preceded by 2 boys who lasted less than a year after birth. Gale was born small and pale and simple-minded. Rhaella produced Rhaegar during the burning of Summerhall, and Viserys after some great work, but between then and the supposed birth of Daenerys she suffered 8 miscarriages or stillbirth. And while a third fluke may occur, it is far more likely that the final pregnancy produced nothing at all. Of course, it would be tremendously difficult to cover up the fact that Daenerys was not born of Queen Rhaella and was born of Ashara Dayne instead. Viserys would certainly remember, but we are given a mechanism for the baby swap to occur. That being when Prince Oberyn visited Braavos to form a marriage pact with Viserys. "It is a secret pact," Dany said, "made in Braavos when I was just a little girl. So Willem Darry signed for us, the man who spirited my brother and myself away from Dragonstone before the usurper's men could take us. Prince Oberyn Martell signed for Dorne, with the Sea Lord of Braavos as witness." She handed the parchment to Sebastian so he might read it for himself. Daenerys 7, A Dance with Dragons. If House Martell acquired Ashara's daughter, who had a striking resemblance to a Targaryen, being of Targaryen blood, it may be that they delivered her as a bargaining chip to Viserys, as a sign of goodwill and faith in the future, or some weird twist and turn in the Game of Thrones. One particularly strange thing about Daenerys is the choice of her name. Daenerys appears a couple of times in the story. In Fire and Blood, which is a late addition in the franchise, Daenerys is the oldest daughter of King Jaehaerys and Alysanne. This doesn't appear in the main A Song of Ice and Fire novels. We're not sure how relevant it is. But the other Daenerys we introduced you in A Dance with Dragons is the Daenerys of the Water Gardens, the Targaryen princess who was married to House Martell in order to bring them into the realm, for whom the Prince of Dorne built the Water Gardens as a refuge in the hot climate. The name Daenerys has strong relevance to the Dornish, but not so much House Targaryen as a whole, and less so King Aerys, who was rather at best indifferent to and at worst hostile to the Dornish. As an aside, the second Daenerys, which was the one that was the daughter of Aegon IV, her name seems to be a portmanteau of Aegon's favourite mistress, Dayna, who was the mother of Daemon Blackfyre, and his wife, Nerys. Queen Rhaella may have been a fan of the Dornish, may have in her dying moment named the child Daenerys, possibly to spite Aerys in some small way, fair enough. But more likely the young boy Viserys would have had chosen the name. Who knows why he would have? Perhaps to signal to the Dornish his goodwill and remembrance of past alliances. Jon took a knee. The king frowned at him and rattled the parchment angrily. "Rise. Tell me, who is Lyanna Mormont?" "One of Lady Major's daughters, sire. The youngest. She was named for my lord father's sister." "To curry your lord father's favour, I don't doubt. I know how the game is played." Jon 1, A Dance with Dragons. So how does Ashara's child end up in the Water Gardens? This comes down to the question, do you think Ashara Dayne threw herself off the tower or a cliff? Often, in the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, someone who falls to death from a tower, presumably from suicide, often is in fact murdered disguised as such. In Fire and Blood, the Princess Jaehaera, who was the daughter of Helena and Aegon II, was very likely murdered, pushed out of a tower, by the hand of the king at the time, Lord Unwin Peake, who was suspected of removing her in order to install his own daughter Mirielle as Aegon III's new queen. We have Sir Courtenay Penrose, who was likely thrown out of a tower at Storm's End by a shadow baby, or some cat's paw inside of Storm's End. And we also have Chiswick, one of Gregor Clegane's men, the same one that was telling the story which Arya overheard about the innkeeper's daughter being stabbed by Sir Gregor and his men, who Arya, in a fit of rage, mentions his name to Jaqen Hagar, who pushes him off the walls of Harrenhal. His fall was passed off as either too much drink, which is pretty usual for the soldiers, or the curse of Black Harren. Are there any examples which I'm forgetting, which are important to the plot? No, I guess not. Any time a character falls to their death in A Song of Ice and Fire, it should be treated with suspicion. And yes, in this case, if Ashara Dayne was pushed to her death, it was by Oberyn Martell. A case could be made that Varys, or one of his cat's paws, could have done the deed. In fact, Varys would have been very well positioned to figure out that the child was Aerys's and wish to secure it, or his future plans. The one thing that makes me doubt this is that Varys hasn't had much influence in Dorne as he had in other places. A possibility, but I'll still presume it's Oberyn. Why, is the question? Obviously, vengeance for Elia. While Ashara Dayne was not directly responsible for Elia's death, House Dayne's plot, or Oberyn's perception that House Dayne was plotting to replace Elia Martell with Ashara Dayne as Prince Rhaegar's queen consort, may have been a grudge he long nursed. Prince Oberyn's presence here is unfortunate. His brother is a cautious man, a reasoned man, subtle, deliberate, even indolent to a degree. He is a man who weighs the consequences of every word and every action. But Oberyn has always been half mad. Is it true he tried to raise Dorne for Viserys? No one speaks of it, but yes. Ravens flew and riders rode, with what secret messages I never knew. Jon Arryn sailed to Sunspear to return Prince Lewin's bones, sat down with Prince Doran, and ended all talk of war. But Robert never went to Dorne thereafter, and Prince Oberyn seldom left it. And after Robert's rebellion, when Doran and his diplomacy prevented Oberyn from launching a full-scale invasion of Westeros, unable to take revenge on Tywin and the Lannisters and Robert and all those responsible for Elia and her children's deaths, Oberyn had a whole lot of time available for him to focus on internal Dornish problems and work out his anger on someone within reach who wouldn't be missed in the grand scheme of things. And given the role House Dayne played in the lead-up to Robert's rebellion, it's possible that House Martell had doubts of their loyalty, and in Ashara's case, especially towards the end of the war, and the role she played then. I mentioned earlier that Ashara would owe the Starks one for sheltering her from Aerys' lusts. One would need to ask themselves how Eddard Stark managed to find the Tower of Joy in the first place, how Sir Gerald Hightower managed to find Prince Rhaegar when even Varys failed to do that, how Eddard Stark would have known to look in Dorne in the first place to find where 3 remaining Kingsguard knights would have taken Lyanna. Unlike some princes, the Starks can at least count above 6, and 7 is above 6. During the Fever Dream in A Game of Thrones, Ned follows his thought process at locating the remaining 3 Kingsguard. He didn't find them at the Trident, he didn't find them at King's Landing, he didn't find them at Storm's End or at Dragonstone. So up until the lifting of the siege at Storm's End, Eddard Stark had no idea where Lyanna and her captors were. It is not like some waypoint marker will be updated as soon as he completes his sub-quest to liberate Storm's End. You could dip into the magical explanation and said he found a weirwood and the weirwood net told him the answer. That would require that he found a weirwood south of the net, and, more importantly, that there be a weirwood present at the Tower of Joy. The Game of Thrones TV adaptation gave us the impression Bloodraven and Bran could see all things, much like the gaze of Sauron. But in the books, from what we can tell so far, the information that the werewolves can get can only come through wild creatures and the eyes carved in the faces of the werewolves themselves. Yes, around Storm's End there was deep forest and deep woods, and in the deep woods there are some leftover weirwoods, but a magical explanation is utterly unnecessary. Eddard Stark, knowing to count to at least 7, can account for the missing Kingsguard. He knows that he's missing a Gerald Hightower, an Oswell Went, and a Sir Arthur Dayne Sword of the Morning. All 3 of them have surviving noble families which he could contact for support. He could go to the Wents at Harrenhal, who is his wife's mother's family, perhaps start looking there. Or he could travel all the way to Old Town and ask the Hightowers what they knew. Or he could go to the girl he danced with one time at that tourney. And perhaps she even came to him. In fact, Sir Gerald Hightower had to go looking for Rhaegar at some point, and his first port of call probably would have been Ashara as well, given she was on hand at King's Landing at some point. Prince Rhaegar's favourite haunt was Summerhall. That was amongst the first targets in which Robert Baratheon advanced upon during the rebellion. It was not a safe place to store anyone, and Rhaegar had to find somewhere else. So he most likely went to his trusted friend Sir Arthur Dayne to find him a hidden place in Dorne. The Mountains of Dorne are a treacherous place, often home of great bandit kings and raiders which have troubled the Seven Kingdoms and the Targaryens for centuries. It would be an ideal place to hide someone or something out of reach of Robert, but also more importantly King Aerys as well, out of Varys' reach. Varys almost certainly didn't know where the tower was, and even if he did, it's clear that he wasn't the one to tell Eddard, as Eddard expresses quite a bit of gratitude for small favours, and Varys seems to receive no goodwill at all when Eddard returns to the King's Landing as Hand of the King. One interesting parallel at this point would be Jon and Stannis' conversation during A Dance with the Dragon, when Jon is suggesting that he march through a mountain pass to reach the hill tribes to gain their favour and the support in the wars to come. Stannis complains that Jon would slow him down with a mountain pass and a goat's trail, whereas Jon points out that the young dragon, Daeron, the Conqueror, invaded Dorne through a goat's trail. Stannis points out that this is apocryphal, and that the Valyrian fleet under Oakenfist took Planky Town long before and played a decisive role, whereas Daeron I made too much out of the goat track. In the same conversation, when Jon offers him guides, Stannis questions if Jon would give him the guides. Jon points out that he will need them in order to navigate the mountain trails. This foreshadowing seems to link the idea that a march through the mountains of Dorne would require a guide who knows the area. And one simply doesn't just walk into Mordor. Not with 10,000 men could Eddard Stark do this. For the mountains of Dorne and the deserts of Dorne have swallowed much larger armies coming from the north. In fact, it's amazing that Eddard Stark made it through the mountains of Dorne alive, considering recent events. The Dornish had just lost Princess Elia, her 2 children, Prince Lewin Martell of Kingsguard, and 10,000 men they'd sent to assist Rhaegar at the Trident. Let's just say they wouldn't be very fond of outsiders at this present point in time, and if one of Robert's top lieutenants happened to wander into the region, they would be very hard-pressed to resist the temptation to capture and torture and mutilate Eddard Stark and his companions in all manner of horrific ways, as the Dornish were known to do. In fact, Eddard's choice of a small fellowship of 7 members would be just as much about speed and stealth as it would be about giving the Kingsguard a fair fight, if, in the worst-case scenario, they found 4 more members to join them. Eddard Stark's denouncement of Robert and the Lannisters for the murder of Elia and her children may have greased the skids somewhat, and perhaps his righteous quest to find his sister would have endeared him to the Martells. Indeed, while Oberyn may have been clamouring to slaughter Eddard Stark at the first possible moment, Doran may have seen an opportunity to let Eddard Stark go deal with Sir Arthur Dayne for them. For if one thing was keeping the Martells from carrying out a punitive expedition against House Dayne, it would have been the fear that Sir Arthur Dayne, hiding somewhere in the mountains, would emerge and rally the stony Dornish against their salty Dornish rivals. House Ironwood would be a huge risk to join them, especially because of Oberyn's recent-ish murder of their lord. So better to lay the deed at the feet of someone else, and delay gratification. But most importantly in all this, Ned Stark would need a chaperone to guide him through the mountains, and for that he would need Ashara. If not herself personally, then some trusted friend of hers. And is there any clue that this happened in the plot? Besides the foreshadowing I've just laid out, you have to go back to A Game of Thrones and Med's recollection of the Tower of Joy when he's visiting the crypts with Robert. And I'll quote, "I was with her when she died," Ned reminded the king. "She wanted to come home, to rest beside Brandon and father. He could hear her still at times. 'Promise me,' she had cried, in a room that smelled of blood and roses. 'Promise me, Ned.' The fever had taken her strength, and her voice had been faint as a whisper. But when he gave her his word, the fear had gone out of his sister's eyes. Ned remembered the way she had smiled then, how tightly her fingers had clutched his, and she gave up her hold on life, the rose petals spilling from her palm, dead and black. After that he remembered nothing. They had found him, still holding her body, silent with grief. The little Crannockman, Howland Reed, had taken her hand from his. Ned could recall none of it. "I bring her flowers when I can," he said. "Lyanna was fond of flowers." Does anyone see what I'm trying to point out here? They had found him still holding her body. They had found him. They, plural. Someone else, besides Ned Stark and Howland Reed, was alive at the Tower of Joy when they found Lyanna. Either they found Lyanna before the duel with the Kingsguard, or they found her afterwards, in which case there was someone else alive there besides the survivors of the duel. In either event, they would have needed a guide and a wet nurse. Now when Eddard returned to Starfall with Dawn to present it either to Ashara Dayne, who was there, or with Ashara Dayne when they returned together, this signalled to Dawn that Sir Arthur Dayne was no more. And whilst House Dayne seems to have some small affection for Eddard, for whatever reason, naming the heir to Starfall after him, it also told Oberyn that Sir Arthur Dayne was no longer a threat, and he could move against Starfall as he pleased. It might seem petty at this point, but you have to consider this from Oberyn's perspective. Ashara Dayne, possibly quite influential inside the household, had demonstrated that she had a strong connection with one of Robert's lieutenants. She has shown a willingness to betray Dornish secret passages through the mountains to outsiders, and in the year after Robert's rebellion, Oberyn was busy trying to raise Dorne for Viserys to take back the Seven Kingdoms. Like Prince Daemon, who is quite similar to Oberyn during the Dance of the Dragons, both would be inclined to take actions against those who prove a liability to the war effort. House Dayne, occupying the Torrentine, and House Ironwood, occupying the passes, both guard entrances into Dorne, and both would act as a fifth column in case Robert decided to invade. At least in the mind of Oberyn, Ashara Dayne posed a threat, and it would be in his interest to terminate that threat as quickly as possible. Part of that may have been to taking her daughter as hostage to the Water Gardens, as Doran likes to collect hostages. Depending on the timing, Ashara may have been killed during the abduction of her daughter, perhaps as an accident, or perhaps because Oberyn wanted to get rid of a particular witness who could contradict the story that this pale-haired, purple-eyed daughter of his was in fact not Daenerys Targaryen sometime in the future. Or perhaps the daughter was taken earlier, and Ashara's assistance to Ned Stark constitutes some violation of the agreement, and Oberyn returned to execute her. The stillborn daughter story may have been a cover, and Ashara's termination would have secured Oberyn's plans for the future. Also, in case you're wondering if Oberyn Martell would be capable of stealing a child or hurting a woman, remember his abduction of Obara Sand, his eldest daughter. Obara was a girl when Oberyn went to claim her. Her mother didn't wish Obara to leave. At this moment, Oberyn struck her across the face and gave young Obara a lone wolf and cub choice. A year after Obara was taken, her mother drank herself to death. So if Oberyn was willing to do this to the mother of one of his children, what would he be willing to do to one of his enemies? This is not the happy ending some would have hoped for. But towards the end of the Game of Thrones, when Eddard confronts Cersei, Cersei wonders if Ashara Dayne killed herself because of the child he stole. And in the same conversation points out Eddard, in the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. These two siblings of House Dayne attempted to reach for the crown, attempted to reach for the throne, and they fell short. And simply sliding into exile and anonymity wasn't enough. They had to die for their failure. Itself a foreshadowing, if secretly, for the fate of Loras, Marjorie, and others who reached high only to fail. Thus ends my analysis of Ashara Dayne and her participation in the events of Robert's Rebellion, the Tourney of Harrenhal, and what went after.